process of learning coding is tough. Sometimes you just get beat down, feel like a dog. So you might as well learn Fetch. Oof. Alright, welcome back to another intermediate JavaScript tutorial. This episode will be on the asynchronous fetch call that is given to us by JavaScript. As always, all the material for this can be found on my GitHub, link in the description. And in the 7th folder, we're going to see something different than usual. Rather than just an HTML file, since we're dealing with making calls to a server, we can't just open up an HTML file, but rather I wrote a small Express server to actually handle the calls that we make. So if you don't have NPM, you're going to have to download that for this episode. NPM or Node Package Manager is something that essentially every JavaScript developer should have. So if you don't have that, I'm not going to cover getting it, but you can just Google the instructions. And then what we're going to do is run node index.js in the 07-fetch directory. And we see that our example app is listening on port 3000. And so that's actually how you get what I'm seeing here. So as for HTTP requests, server calls are the primary method of communication between the client and the server, but Ajax calls are the primary method for loading new information without a page reload. There are various different approaches to delivering an HTML page to the client. You might server-side render, you might client-side render, but either way, when someone visits your web page, they're given a specific amount of information. Now, to be able to get new information without a page reload, you're then forced to use one of only a few different options. There are things called WebSockets that we're not going to talk about today, but the primary method is this Ajax call, and specifically the Fetch API, which replaced the old XML HTTP request. And as you can see here, it's using the promise-based interface. So what are the basics? So requests are made by using fetch, given the URL, and then an optional parameter object, which allows you to specify all sorts of different things. If you just pass a URL, it will be taken as a GET request, but in the parameters you can specify the method as POST. Now what I've done on this simple Express server is create endpoints for both test GET and test POST. So what we can do here is create a fetch at test GET, and the response back is a promise. Because that's promise-based, we can then say, then take the response, and then just console.log that response. And when we open that up, you can see some information about the call. We see the URL it was sent to, that the status is 200, which is the standard successful response. OK is true, status.text, OK. You can then see headers and then a body response. As for the post request, if we just try and send this right away, we're actually going to see that it fails. The reason is that test post is expecting the method of post. We don't have a get endpoint set up for test post. What we're going to do is add in this parameter object and then say method post. And if we run that, there's a 2-second delay, which I added to the server to simulate a slower connection. But eventually, when we get it back, we see a lot of the same stuff. Now, something that is different between the two calls that you can't see right now is the body. And there are specific ways of interacting with the response that we'll cover now. So as for responses, a response will fail with a type error whenever a call is prevented. The response may be checked via response.ok, which we can see here, OK, true. But the response body has to be extracted using one of these methods: blob, JSON, text, array buffer, or form data. And these are also promise-based. So to look at one of these responses, I'm going to take the sample GET request that we had and modify it a little bit. What I want is to make a variable of our body and set that to await response.text and then log that out. But in order to use await, we're going to have to make this arrow function an asynchronous call. And if we do that, you see that we're getting a string of the response. Now we could do the same thing, let's say JSON, and that gives us an actual object where we can access the message And these are things that are included in the response by the server. So these aren't going to always be there. This is specific to our server example. And for this video, we're going to be using primarily this JSON method. Now, the final note here is there's no CORS allowed by default. CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, and this is a safety precaution that's built into the API so that if you opened a page, the script couldn't make a call to some other server passing away information, for example, about the user. And if you want to learn more about that, I put a link to it at the bottom of this page. So let's look at some more realistic code examples. I'll clear this off. And the two simple examples are simple get request and simple post request. Now, if we open them up in the code, we see here that we're using an asynchronous function, simple get request, instead of using a promise, and we're throwing everything in this try catch block. So where before we were using a dot then after this fetch, here we're just going to create a constant response, which is awaiting the fetch response. We'll then log that out and check to make sure that it's okay. If it's not okay, just throw an error, bad call, and we'll log that out. And that can be then handled by your code in a larger application. And since we want to see the JSON response, we're going to await response.json as this response JSON variable, and then just log that out. So if we run that, we see what we saw before. We're getting that response, and then we're specifically getting the body of the response. A simple post request is pretty much the same thing, but we're passing in these arguments. You can specify headers, and in our case, we're saying content type is an application/JSON. And then what I'm allowing here is to pass in an object in this function, and the body will be a stringified version of that object, noting that we also specified the method as post. But then we're pretty much doing the same thing, getting the response, checking for an error, and then logging it out. So let's clear that off and then run simple post request. And this one has a 2-second delay on it, which I handled on the server. So here we see message post updated with an empty body. Again, this body is actually specific to our example. The server's spitting back whatever we pass in our body. So if I pass in an object, I can set a key to 1, 2, 3, S2, 1, 2, 3, and this will be accessible by the server. So if we run that and wait 2 seconds, we get our response back, and our server is telling us what it had access to, which is this object that we specified above. So the power of functionality that this opens up is basically limitless. Take, for example, a social media app where you want to follow somebody. Rather than clicking follow and then waiting for the entire page to reload again, you can click follow, pass in the arguments that are required, then the server handles the actual business logic of that and gives you back a response if your attempt to follow was successful or not. If it was, then you can re-render specific parts of your page, saying that you're following one more person, but doing all of this without actually the overhead of reloading a page. This is especially important when it comes to mobile devices, which generally don't have as high of bandwidth as desktop computers. So as a final example, I wanted to show a practical example of how this would be utilized in a modern application. What I first did was find a GIF to use as a loading symbol, and then created these buttons that you can click that are using both the simple get and simple post request that we specified above. It's making a call to the server, and when the server responds, it's going to print out the response on this page. Now, if we run the get, it happens almost instantly, and that's because it's just sending the response, the server's sending it right back, whereas the simple post is delayed. So if we click that, we can see this loading icon, and then it disappears, and we're given the response. Now, that's something that's important. The user should know that the content is loading. You don't want someone to click a button, they don't see anything, and it seems like nothing's happening, so they try clicking it again, and you're either not making another call or you're going to end up making a second call. So you could see where that might get problematic. It's also something that everyone just expects. So let's look a little more at how this is done. The first thing we're doing is defining variables, both for our buttons, our image, and our result div. We're also then defining this isCalling variable, and we'll use that to track if a call's already in place. We're actually going to kind of look at this from the back up. Both the get and the post are doing essentially the same thing. We're using this make call function, which I wrote above, passing in our URL, and in the case of the post request, our parameter object. In this case, we're just setting the body to this extra content. This call was run from an onClick element. Now, as we saw above, a get call doesn't use the body. What we can do instead is pass in parameters through the URL. So at the end of our URL, we add a question mark, then we can add one variable in at a time. So first we have message, and we're encoding it with encode URI. That's because, for example, if you press spacebar, the URL can't have an actual space in it. So that'll be %20 or something like that. And then if we wanted to add another one, for example, we could just say and second equals 45, and that'll pass in 45. So both of these are using the same make call and handle response. Handle response is just taking our response, making sure that it exists, and if so, log it out, and also set our results.inner text to a stringified version of the JSON. For our make call, we're utilizing that isCalling variable and saying if we're already calling, don't do anything else. But if we're not, then set our isCalling to true and make our call. So we're going to fetch with the URL and the call parameters. Then, as we did before, check if it's okay, otherwise throw an error, and then at the end just return the response.json. If we didn't want to actually log out the response, we could just say response.text, then we wouldn't have to use json.stringify later. As for our set isCalling, if we want to set our isCalling to true, but then we're also going to take our loading image and remove the isHidden CSS attribute, and if we want to say that we're no longer calling, then our isCalling is going to be set to false, and our loading image is going to then receive that CSS attribute isHidden. Now, if we actually scroll up and get a hold of this image, I think this is important to point out. So we're using the ID to grab the variable by JavaScript, but then we have two different classes. We have isHidden and loading cat. The loading cat is what we're using for the general styling of things, whereas isHidden is a class that we're using to hide things. Now, something that we could do is just take the image and set its style attribute of display to none, and when we want to show it again, send it to block. But what this pattern here does is it allows us to use this isHidden on a bunch of different things. We might have different sections of the page that we want to hide at different times, and some of those might be using different types of display block, display flex. And when you have to keep track of what's getting displayed how, you can run into a lot of headaches. So it's a lot easier just to have a generic isHidden class in this case, which is going to be separate from the loading cat styling. If we scroll to the way top, we can see these here. Our isHidden is just display none. So if you remove that isHidden, it's just going to be the default display style. So let's actually refresh this. And if we run our simple get, we see our message again, but we also see second with a value of 45. And so this is just important to remember that you're able to pass in multiple values. Now, whenever you follow a tutorial, it's important for you to actually not just watch, but try and do what you see. I can't stress how important this is, especially when it relates to using Ajax calls. It's an absolutely integral part of programming in a modern application. It's something that virtually any new web application is using. So I think it's extremely important to get used to this. I didn't specifically cover the server side of things, but you can see that in the index.js, where we see our two requests are defined are this app.get and app.post, which is why you can't make a post request to test.get. We're just checking for a get request, and in the case of post, we're just looking for a post request. And here you see where we're taking our query params and adding that to our response JSON, and in our post, we're adding our body with request.body. So I hope you guys found this useful. I genuinely hope you play around with this a little bit, see if you run into problems, get past those, and really start to understand how it works. It's something that can get vastly more complicated when it comes to different headers and all sorts of things that can increase the power, but also the complexity of the fetch call. I also want to note that there are different libraries to deal with this. An extremely popular one to use is called Axios, so that's also worth looking into. Anyways, if you got anything valuable out of the video, feel free to subscribe for more content like this, or even leave a comment or drop a like to help out the channel. Thanks guys, and see you next time.